Um, I want to say hello and welcome to our very first Goucher Environmental Dialogues. I'm Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of the Environmental Sustainability and Management program here at Goucher College. And the Goucher Environmental Dialogues for right now, they're a web-based speaker series or really a conversation series. And we feature cultivated conversations with different environmental, sustainability, and climate leaders, visionaries, and innovators. And this series is hosted by Goucher's progressive new Masters in Environmental Sustainability and Management program. And because some of you may have some questions about our new Environmental Sustainability graduate program at Goucher College, I'll probably save the last 5 minutes of our hour together today to take any questions that you might have about our program. We're holding an information session on this new master's degree, just an FYI, on March 15th at 6 p.m. And I also want to say that our Goucher Environmental Dialogue series will be offered about every month or so moving forward. So please stay tuned for more conversations and follow us on Goucher Environmental social media, which, let me pull up the chat here. I'll post the link to here in the chat for you to follow. That's our link tree with all the links to everything, so you guys can access information sessions, social media, and things like that, so you can follow future Goucher Environmental Dialogues speaker series. That being said, everyone, welcome today. I'm glad you could join us. We are recording this session because I often get that question, and we will share the recording with you. Spring is arriving early here in Maryland, and that makes me in particular think about getting outside more and going for a hike, especially with my family. Especially like to take my family to nearby state parks and visit Shenandoah National Park. But public lands have a history of attracting more white visitors over people of color. And here with me today is Dr. Tashari White to help unpack this and discuss Black Americans and the environment more broadly. Dr. Tashari White serves as an adjunct faculty member for the Environmental Sciences and Policy program at Johns Hopkins University and instructs a course in environmental justice and inequality. Tashari has a background in environmental studies, sustainability, and biology, and she specializes in environmental justice, diversity and inclusion, and Black geographies. Tashari advocates for diverse narratives on racial inequality and in the fields of environmental studies and geography. Her research interests include race and ethnicity, just sustainabilities, environmental ethics, Black American environmental history, and environmental racism. She currently works as a postdoctoral fellow for the geography department at the University of South Carolina. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tashari White by indicating in the chat, I realize you can't say anything the way it's set up right now, but indicating in the chat where you're logging in from, because we have people joining from all over geographically speaking. Some are from here in Baltimore, and I know we've had people registered to attend from other states and other countries, and we even have a high school class joining us right now, from what I understand. So welcome, everyone. Welcome in the chat. And if you have any questions during our conversation, you can ask them in the chat, and I will try to give voice to them towards the middle to the end of our conversation. All right, thank you. And Tashari, don't forget to turn your camera on so we can see you.
I thought it was on the whole time.
Oh, okay. For some reason, it wasn't showing up on my Teams. I'm still getting used to Teams. I apologize. I am so used to doing this in Zoom. There you go. There's your beautiful face. Okay. Thank you so much. So Tashari, the title of our conversation today is Black Americans and the Environment. So I wanted to start by asking you, how do you define Black Americans and how do you define the environment in your work?
That is a great question. So I define Black Americans as anyone who identifies as Black and lives in the United States. So that includes Black immigrants from other countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, Honduras, etc. So the reasoning behind this is because I know many Black people from Black countries that feel like they are categorized as African American when they come to the States. They are seen by non-Black people as African American and treated as such, despite their cultural distinctions. So I myself have been called African American when I see myself more so as Afro Caribbean or Jamaican American. Um, while conducting my research in my survey, I did ask people whether they identified as Black, and some people would say no. But in their open ended response to the question, what is your ethnicity or nationality, they would say Trinidadian, or they would name another Caribbean or African country. So they may be equating Black to African American and just don't see themselves as such because of their national and subcultural differences. When it comes to defining the environment, I would say that's anywhere really. It's subjective depending on who you ask. The environment can be natural or it can be man made. It can be a person's home or it can be a stream. It just depends on where you are and your perspective of it. I think for me personally, I have a broader definition of what the environment is due to the nature of my work. I think it includes anything from my home to my office on campus to the plains of Africa. It's all encompassing for me. Um, in my research, however, most Black Americans have identified the environment as their immediate surroundings, while environmental professionals may define the environment as a national park, right? Like the Great Smoky Mountains or, certain ecosystems.
I like that you pointed out how you're defining Black Americans, and that. So I just finished reading the book Caste by Isabella Wilkerson, and she was in that book. She points out that I don't remember who she was talking to, but most of the Africans that live in the continent of Africa don't consider themselves Black. That's really kind of an American description. And so I think that's interesting from a researcher perspective, how you've approached the way that you're looking at that. So I do appreciate that. And then also from having lived in a rural and an urban setting, environment can be many different things. So yeah, that's a big thing to tackle. In reading your work, you note in your work that many scholars have called attention to the low engagement in outdoor recreation, environmental activities, and the nature participation from Black Americans when compared to white Americans. So my first question is how is this low participation in nature, how has it been measured for Black Americans, and is that reliable? And then I'm going to couple that with my second question. My second question is, what is your thesis for why this is the case? And what do other scholars overlook in their explanations? So I guess let's start with the measurement first. How do we know this? And is that accurate?
Yeah, so low participation in national parks is typically measured through surveys, typically telephone surveys and census data. There are some qualitative studies done, but for the most part, I think they're quantitative. Um, One of the most recent studies by the National Park Service was in 2018, and that study reported that 77% of visitors to national parks are white. There's 419 national parks, and the vast majority of visitors are white. Now, in the United States, 42% of the US population is comprised of people of color. However, only 23% of people of color visit national parks, and only 6% identify as Black. Um, so the demographics of national park visitors are not representative of the entire population. Um, so I think as far as reliability, I think any study done, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, is liable for some margin of error. I think, especially in qualitative studies, people, when you're working with people and talking to people, sometimes they may feel like they're obligated to say something that the researcher wants to hear, or they may not be entirely truthful or ashamed of their answer, or just don't feel comfortable disclosing certain information. So I think it's important for participants to know that researchers are looking for honest answers. It is a bit challenging to rely on this data, but it's it's what we have. Now, as far as my thesis is concerned for why it is the way that it is, I would say the I would say it's more so related to the repercussions of slavery and colonialism that's resulted in a cultural trauma. I think trauma has been mentioned before in research, but only in a few research studies. There's only a few that have really made it a central argument. I think some scholars are apprehensive to say that slavery has any direct correlation to the lack of participation in nature from Black people because slavery happened so long ago, Jim Crow happened so long ago, but trauma doesn't have an expiration date. I think a lot of the scientific community tries to do things objectively and with numbers, which overlooks some of the critical issues and findings that you can't get to by conducting just a qualitative survey alone. So I think for the scientific community, having a mixed methods approach is I think is really critical for a deeper understanding of these issues.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And for anyone who's listening and who's not quite sure what we're talking about in terms of mixed methods, like Tashara uses both, if I'm remembering correctly, use both survey research for like to collect the numbers side of things, right? And then you interview people to get a deeper dive into their meanings and connections. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you'd mentioned slavery shaping Americans' views of the environment
Oh,
specific.
one
Oh, go
moment.
ahead.
Some people
Yeah.
are saying in the chat that they can't see or they can't see it, but they can only hear it.
Oh. Um, well, I'll try and troubleshoot that while we continue talking. At least they can hear it, which is a conversation, so that's the main point. Uh, You can always later watch the video of this when I post that, you guys. So don't worry about that. This is our first time using Teams, so bear with us now. I am seeing in the chat that several people can see in here. So
Okay.
try playing with your settings in Teams. Not sure if that's the issue or not, but I'll try and troubleshoot that way while people are while we're talking. Um, but going back to what extent has slavery shaped Black Americans' views of the environment? Like, can we dig into that a little bit deeper in terms of how? Because I know slavery was quite traumatic and lasted for a very long time in the US. So, how can that trauma be translated to a view of the wilderness, the nature landscape?
Um, so I think slavery has shaped the entire nation, right, in a multitude of ways. But more specifically, I think slavery has shaped the views of Black and white Americans in ways that are irrevocable. Black people were stolen, they were taken from their homeland, they were shipped across large bodies of water to to a foreign land, to a foreign country where they were literally beaten to death if they did not work the land, if they didn't cultivate crops. There are so many horror stories that Black people experienced in such a hostile environment. However, there were some enslaved people that escaped. They escaped to the mountains, they escaped to the swamps, like the Great Dismal Swamp. Um, and they did cultivate a life for themselves using the natural resources around them. Um, so, because of that, I think Black people have a complex relationship, and their views are on a spectrum from I hate this to I love this, and all the things in between. Some people may be willing to explore the outdoors, but they have boundaries to their participation. They may like going on a nature walk, but they may hate the concept of camping in the dark woods for several nights at a time. Um, Mostly, however, I found that in my study at least, Black people do like going outdoors, but they may have reservations about the types of outdoor spaces that they're willing to visit. And they may have reservations about certain outdoor recreational activities. Um, that is attributed to the historical violence their ancestors have experienced and the possibility that those things could happen to them.
Mhm.
And there's conception that the woods are not safe.
Yeah, you specifically mentioned the woods, and I remember reading in your work trees and the connection to lynching. And so can you talk a little bit more about that connection between lynching, the lynching of innocent Black people historically, and the concept of wilderness and woods?
Yeah, I wish I could show you. There's two maps that I like to use to demonstrate this. They're both available online. One is titled Lynching in America, and the other is titled Monroe and Florence Work Today. So both maps show data for lynching in America during the Jim Crow era, so from about like the 1870s to 1950s. But most of the lynchings occurred in the South, where a lot of Black people still reside today. Um, but lynching is not just being hung on a tree, it's also being chased in the woods or brutally murdered in public just for being Black, just for looking at someone white and what they felt like was threatening could get a Black person killed. Um, in an environmental context, lynching took place in wooded areas, sometimes at night. The KKK, which still exists today, would have gatherings in the woods to lynch Black people. White people would gather around, men, women, and children, to witness the lynching of Black and brown people. So it was a genocide attempt, but I think the locality of it all created this stigma and bad representation of the woods. So imagine nearly 100 years of people that looked like me were being dragged into the woods and slung up on a tree like a poached animal.
Mhm.
Um, it the imagery and you know just the like the feelings and the sentiment that you get when you see and hear about these things. It's like this could happen to me, and there are modern day examples of these happenings. So it's still very much relevant. Um, as far as the entire concept of wilderness in the woods, it's a social construct that was created by white men for white men. Wilderness was conceptualized as a pristine place. It
Mhm.
was romanticized where other forms of humanities were not allowed. Indigenous people did not think of their land as wilderness, but as home. Colonizers came and they came up with that ideology. They forced natives out, and they thought it was their God-given right to control nature and to remove people who did not look like them.
Mhm.
It was the idea of an American frontier and the great outdoors becoming a part of this national identity. They were called America's best idea, but they were segregated. Um, so wilderness, since its creation, has been a predominantly white space, like much of American society.
Yeah, I think you did a great job explaining that to those of us. Um, I think that maybe haven't either thought on it much. I know that when I've talked about national parks in terms of that pristine view and how mistaken that is. Um, but until reading your work, I hadn't necessarily made that connection with slavery and lynchings and Black American geographies in your work. And I want to thank Max and Amy for sharing the resources that you were talking about in the chat while you were talking about them. I really appreciate that. That gives a nice kind of breadcrumb trail for us to follow. Um, so, based on the work you're doing in Black Americans today, I'm going to kind of put these two thoughts together. What connection do Black Americans have with nature today? Because it doesn't seem, it seems like a lot of the Black Americans that I know still have a strong connection with nature, but it's just not necessarily the same way that that white Americans view the connection of nature in terms of their idealized view of nature. So it's a different type of connection. So that's my first question. Well, I'll let you answer that first before I go into my next question. I have a lot of questions for you based on your work.
So I think the connection is a bit disjointed. There's a lot of stigma around wilderness not being a safe space, but also wilderness locations are not readily available to Black Americans where they live in the South. I think I may be wrong, but the only national park is the Great Smoky Mountains. There's not a lot. A lot of them are on the West Coast. Um, so not only is there not a general interest, um, but it's also just not very accessible. Um, Based on my studies, Black people have more of a spiritual connection with nature. In my interviews, Black people reported that they go outside for spiritual reasons. So whether that's to intentionally be one with the earth or to just feel at peace. Some of them mentioned the spiritual method of grounding, like taking off your shoes and walking in the grass or sitting outside in the grass or even submersing yourself like underground as a way to heal themselves. They mentioned mental clarity and mental health as well. So my analysis or my interpretation is that Black people do have a connection with nature, but it may be more so closer to home than a national or state park. Um, there's also this perception of assimilation, like Black Americans have assimilated so much to white culture that that's a form of resistance by not going to national parks. They feel like, well, it's too much of a white thing or white activity. So, white people do that, and I'm not interested in what white people do. So there's also cultural um, like there's a cultural disconnect as well. But I have seen a resurgence. There's several groups, Outdoor Afro, I think Diversity in the Outdoors, Brothers of Climbing. There's a few that are popping up across the nation that are motivating people of color to get back outside and get outdoors as well. So I think that people are, that's just another form of resistance as well as saying this space wasn't for me, but I'm going to partake in it anyway. So, yeah.
Do you feel that, or to what extent do you feel that Black Americans, their connection with the environment is a healthy one, or does it need to be healed in some way, or is there that past trauma that needs to be overcome?
Yeah. I think it can be healed over time, just like any traumatic experience, but a part of healing is acknowledgement. If you aren't aware that you're traumatized, then you can't heal. So the first part of it is really awareness, and then going from there. I'm not sure if Black Americans will ever truly heal from slavery. It wasn't just the physical labor, but the abuse. Mentally and physically, it was inhumane and cruel. Um, and some of the things that Black people experience, we're still experiencing in different forms today through systematic racism. Um, and I also just think that there are other injustices that surpass diversity and inclusion in national parks. And until those things are addressed properly, this aspect of racism, this particular issue, will be on the back burner. So when there's equity in job placement and pay, when there's no police brutality, when we're able to liberate Black men from the new Jim Crow of incarceration, then maybe we can turn our gaze to the luxury of outdoor recreation. But those things rightfully come first. There's so much healing to do, and knowing that we have to heal without, at the very least, an apology is going to be hard, especially when so many powerful forces are against you every step of the way. It's toxic, um, and it will be difficult. But I do think it's possible. It's just a matter of working out the details of how to heal. Um, it's gonna be tough.
I have a I have a colleague who's currently she's working on her dissertation right now, and she's studying the diversity on different nonprofits, how on their different boards. And a subset of that, I think, is the environmental nonprofits. And it made me think when I was reading your work, because I think in one of the things you wrote, you had talked about how most environmental organizations are very whitewashed. There's very little diversity. Um, how can environmental organizations do two things, I guess? One is better engage Black Americans, um, and may also better incorporate that into their work. And and why is it essential that they do so?
So I don't have exact numbers on the, I guess, labor side of environmental organizations, but Dorsetta E. Taylor, she has done a lot of work on environmental organizations and their demographics. So if anyone's interested in looking at her work, I think it's called Green 2.0 or something like that. But I think it's pretty reflective of like the demographics that I mentioned earlier, where it's predominantly white, of course. Um, and I know that some parks are trying to diversify their park visitors, but they also need to diversify their park staff, right? And I think so. What I came up with in my dissertation, at least, was what I like to call the triple A method, which is to acknowledge, address, and adapt. I think for environmental organizations, it takes some self acknowledgement internally, not just on an organizational level, but individually acknowledge the ways that you've contributed to systematic racism. Like, did you deny somebody because of their unique name? Even though they had the qualifications, like things like that. I think it's important to address it publicly. These are how things used to be, but we acknowledge that this isn't right and we're going to hold ourselves accountable. And adapting is just adapting to a new society, to new demographics, and creating tangible and not performative ways to integrate these changes from the top down. I think it's important for any organization to be inclusive and diverse because people of different backgrounds have different experiences in life and professionally that foster new ideas. So we can see that one demographic in the national park system has not gotten people of color interested in the outdoors. Um, and I think it has grave consequences for the environment itself, but also for environmental education, for the resiliency of Black and Brown communities across the world that are substantially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So I think national parks have to be diverse or else they'll become irrelevant. And then we'll lose even more land if people aren't interested in them.
I think that makes sense. We had a question in the chat. If you could restate that name again, was it Dorsetta E of the person that you mentioned earlier? Um,
Rosetta E. Taylor.
there you go. Thank you. Thanks for the spelling correct. Okay. I wanted to ask too, what are you working on right now as part of your postdoc?
So currently I'm working on an energy justice project in South Carolina, and Tennessee, doing some qualitative research. We're asking residents and energy workers across both states about the energy system transition. So moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energies. What does that look like? What are they apprehensive about? Do they have any concerns? Um, and so far, residents have been a little apprehensive about the reliability of renewable energies like solar panels, not having very much longevity or having holes in the roof or cost concerns, things like that. So that is what I'm working on right now.
Just curious, is most of the renewable energy there like solar panels on homes, or is it more like centrally located like solar farms? Just curious.
There is a solar farm being built currently in Lower Richland. I'm not entirely sure how they're going to distribute power from the farm. I'm not sure if it's for one particular entity or if it's going to be used for, if it's for public usage or anything like that. But people are concerned about installing solar panels on their homes because they say, you know, um, they're expensive. After a couple of years or 10 years, you're paying this month to month, and then by the time the 10 years are done and you're done paying it off, you have to buy new solar panels because they only last about that long. Um, Having holes in their roof, and when it rains, they're having leaks, and it just seems to be more trouble than it's worth.
And so what element of that work is the environmental justice component?
So the environmental justice component is really just trying to democratize the energy system and ask people what kind of energy system they want for their community, instead of having this conversation and excluding the people that have least access to energy or are paying a lot of money for their energy bills. So that's where the justice
Okay.
part comes.
Well, it's a neat project to be working on, much needed. Great. Um, in your work, both with your dissertation and your postdoc, can you elaborate on your experience as a woman of color working and researching in the environmental field and what that's been like?
Um, I have a lot of stories. But yeah, it's been challenging at times. I've been met with discrimination. I've been met with racism that were both outright and subtle. There's been situations that I've been put in because people explicitly said that they don't like what I'm doing. They don't like my work. Um, they feel uncomfortable or they don't want to work with me specifically because of what I'm talking about. Um, so it's not like I'm talking about these things and I don't have any experience in it. Um, Aside from that, while pursuing my career and attending classes, I just couldn't relate to my colleagues. I couldn't relate to my classmates. I couldn't relate to the course material. I couldn't relate to my professors. And I also felt like I had to be a spokesperson for diversity and inclusion in every class. People were turning to me and asking me questions like, what would a person of color think about this or things like that. And I kind of had to become a diversity expert by default. And I also felt compelled to, because a lot of the things that we were reading just didn't include our narratives. And it angered me. So I did feel like I had to speak up. Um, so in this field, it's like you have a lot of silent labor as a person of color to do things that you just didn't like. I went in thinking I was gonna study something else, and came out feeling like, oh well, I have to do this because there's no representation.
That's powerful to think about. And it's something to, you must be exhausted just thinking about that. Just realize you're trying to do your own work, but then you're also kind of standing in because there's nobody else. And you become the default to explain what we need to be done. And you become the activist at the same time as being the researcher,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome, but at the same point, exhausting.
Yeah.
Um, that's that's interesting to hear. And I have to ask the next question just because running a program where there's graduate students, inevitably they ask about research and research opportunities. What do you see as the area most in need of research in terms of the environmental justice field?
So I think there needs to be more like psychological studies done, or I guess in an experimental way, on the relationship between Black people and the outdoors. Our relationship is really complex. So understanding the ways in which we do and do not participate, or how we feel comfortable or uncomfortable looking at things like, if you see a picture of a beach, do you want to go? Most people in my studies have said, yeah, I prefer the beach over the mountains. So having like things like that, I think would be kind of insightful. Or putting them in set environments, like what does it make you, like what feelings do you have when you're in the woods? I think kind of studies like that would be really important. I also think biological studies on the epigenetics of trauma in Black
Mm,
people is really important. I do know that there was one study done recently, about how trauma is in our DNA, but I think more needs to explore with that in an environmental context. I'm not sure how that would be
yeah.
done. Yeah.
Boy, do you have any time to be an advisor for any of these ideas or take them on? I think these are great ideas. Yeah, I think these are awesome ideas for research. Well, I did say that middle to the end, we'd leave time for questions from the chat. So I know we have one question that came in. What can white people do to create outdoor spaces that are more welcoming to the BIPOC community? It's a really good question.
That is a good question. I would say forming allyship is really important. Um, and it's hard because it's like just me saying this is traumatic and this needs to change should be enough. But unfortunately, in the society that we're in, it takes sometimes white people to say, this is wrong and we shouldn't treat Black and brown people like this, in order for other white people to listen. So I think speaking up is really important. Educating yourself is really important. I teach majority white classes, and I tell my students to do their own homework, do their own research, take an environmental studies class if you can, take environmental justice courses if you can, um, just really become knowledgeable on the ways in which Black and brown people are oppressed. And when you see things, say something about it. Don't be a bystander um, of injustice. As far as particular ways. I'm not entirely sure, aside from just integrating yourself in the work, just learning more about it. I think it takes, like I said, like a tangible effort and not something that's performative. So if you're, I don't know what the audience is, but if you're in a position where you're on a search committee or something like that, it's important to also realize that, yeah, maybe somebody doesn't have all of the qualifications, or maybe they do. Um, but also realizing that people have different advantages in education and opportunities, and just because someone may be lacking, I don't know, maybe they're not very well published, but they have a lot of work experience. I think taking things into consideration, like, well, maybe they were disadvantaged, and and maybe they had to work really hard, or maybe they had to work extra jobs, or like, just finding, like, figuring out the gaps, I guess, um in what people are going through, is really important as well.
Yeah, I think those are really excellent recommendations. I wanted to also remind our listeners that you can post a question for Dr. White in the chat, and I'll give voice to your question. I know it might be a little frustrating in the webinar format to not be able to turn your camera and microphone on. Um, I was also going to say, I was going to ask Dr. White, did you take an environmental justice course when you were an undergraduate, or I guess, when was the first time you were exposed to this concept of social justice and connecting to sort of environmental studies in your collegiate journey, if you will?
Yeah, so my first exposure to environmental justice, I took an environmental studies class. I actually switched my major from biology to environmental studies. That's a whole other backstory. But I switched my major. I took an environmental studies class. It was an intro class, and I walked in and I saw one other person of color. It was another Black woman. And that was startling to me, because in biology, you had people that were from all over, all different backgrounds. And then walking into a classroom where it was predominantly white, at a school that was pretty diverse at the time as well, it made me question, well, where's all the, like, what happened here? Like, where's all the people of color? Oh, why aren't they in this class? Why aren't they in this program? And I did go to my advisor and I did ask him, like, what's going on? And he said, well, there was only one other Black graduate, you know, um, in this program before you. So it, he's like, this is a thing. There aren't many Black people in this field. And that kind of, like, just spiraled out of control, and I am where I am now. So that was my first exposure to it. I did take an environmental justice course at SUNY ESF in Syracuse, with Dr. Lemire Tehran. He was a great environmental justice professor. He was one of my advisors on my committee. So yeah, so I did take an environmental justice class, but I had already kind of gotten on that trend in undergrad.
So that might answer one of our questions, which is what made you go into the environmental studies. To follow up with the second question there, what are some of your favorite Black-led environmental organizations?
Um, I would say there's the the Center for Environmental Justice in the Deep South. I think I'm saying that right. We Act for Environmental Justice is another one. Um, and I'm blanking on all the rest, but those are two that are very popular and prominent right now.
Okay, those are good recommendations for people to look further into, we had a question from Max. Has anyone done research on mental health, spending time in nature, and the BIPOC community?
Um, I want to say that that's an area that needs to be explored more. I haven't seen much on that, aside from just like generally that, going outside is good for your mental health. But I haven't seen any studies done particularly on, BIPOC communities and nature and mental health.
Our next question is from our Walt Whitman High School. Hi, you guys. They would like to know how they can, as a high school students, advocate before it's too late. Advocate for environmental justice. Sorry.
Oh, um, I think I'm not entirely sure, but I feel like just integrating it into the curriculum, maybe having guest speakers come and talk to some of your classes, whether that's through Zoom or in person, talking to anyone who's local, who's doing the work, or nearby who's doing the work within North Carolina, would also probably be a good place to start.
Okay. And I think that's all of our questions from our listeners. I want to thank Destiny and Max for posting those links as well. It's really nice to have such active participants today to share all the links as we're talking about things. And I like the format that we used where we just had our conversation. I did promise that I would leave just a few minutes to talk about our new program. So that's the last kind of 5 minutes. So I'll do that. But I wanted to thank you, Tashari, for being able to tell us some more about your research and really get us even more excited to hear more about some of the breakthroughs that are going on in environmental justice research. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your the energy work that you're doing as well, and having you teach our environmental justice course for us here in the future. So that'll be great. I want to share in the chat really fast our link tree um, to our program, Goucher Environmental, because we're going to have another Goucher Environmental Dialogue coming up in April, focusing on the legal rights of nature. And I think that's going to be about the week of Earth Day. So I'm not 100% sure exactly which day that is, but I'll be talking to Dr. Erin O'Donnell from the University of Melbourne. So there'll probably be like a 14-hour difference between me and my speaker. Hopefully not too much of a delay there, but and we'll be talking about legal personhood of rivers. Um, and I see we have one more question for you, so I'll go ahead and ask that. What are some of the challenges that you faced finding work in this field?
Um, I had a lot of challenges, and I think that that's one of the main reasons why I just kept continuing my education because I got my undergraduate degree. I had this horrible desk job working for an environmental service company. And I was like, this just can't be life. I have to find something else to do. And I reached out to one of my advisors from UNCG, and he said, well, you can apply for a master's program somewhere. And that's how I got into SUNY ESF. And once I was done with that, I was applying for jobs probably a year out before even graduating. And I got so many rejection letters and I couldn't find anything. I had a couple of interviews, but nothing ever came through. And I just didn't know, what else to do. I reached out to my undergraduate advisor again. We have a very good rapport. His name is Dr. Aaron Allen at UNCG. And I was just like, I don't know what to do. Like, what should I do? He's like, well, we have a geography program, a PhD here. So why don't you apply? And, you're more than likely will get in. You got good grades or whatever. So I applied and I got in. So it just seemed like that was the only thing that was working for me was just continuing my education. I literally tried everything else and I just I just never got anything. So that's just how it worked out for me. Um, but it may be different for other people. I don't know.
I think it was the right path for you. And
Yeah.
so, what was so you've written, I've read your dissertation. Um, have you written a book based on your dissertation work? Or is that the main thing to look at right now? I've read some of your other publications too. Um, so if someone wants to really dig into your work, what do you recommend they dig into?
Yeah, my dissertation is what's out right now. I do plan on putting out an article soon titled "The
Okay,
South is a Sick Place." Um, so that is in progress. But
okay.
right now, the dissertation is where you'll find most of my work right now.
And I think it was really fascinating, so I recommend it. I know that I'm a nerd, so I'm one of those people that browse dissertations, but I thought it was really fascinating, your methods and your conclusions. Um, and because I did promise I'd spend like just a few minutes introducing our brand new graduate program, which has a very strong emphasis on environmental justice. I'm going to briefly just talk about that for anyone who's interested in joining our information session on March 15th. Um, really fast here. Can you guys see you can see the screen, right? Tashari, can you see the screen? Okay. All right, I'm going to scroll it up really fast. So for those of you that are interested in joining our information session, I posted that link in the chat. And Goucher College has just launched a new master's degree in environmental sustainability and management. And it's designed really for the busy professional. So it's got highly flexible courses. It's 100%, courses can be done 100% online or in a hybrid format where you take courses in person on campus, our beautiful campus here in Baltimore, or online and a combination of on campus and online. It can be completed as fast as 15 months, or the average time of completion is closer to 2 years. It requires 12 courses. There's no residency requirement, which is, again, to help the working professional. We have a rolling admission, so we have semesters in the fall, spring, and summer, and a rolling admission. We are accepting applications right now for our fall 2023 cohort. So if you are interested, I do encourage you to join that information session. And if you are thinking about a career in the environmental sustainability and environmental justice kind of realm, and you're interested in some of the talks that we're going to be having with these environmental dialogues, like our conversation with Dr. Tashari White today, and our conversation that we'll have in April on the legal rights of nature, conversations like this, I think you might want to take a closer look at what these careers in sustainability and environmental management look like. So at Goucher College, our master's degree focuses on using systems thinking as an adaptation and as management strategy for managing environmental resources. We also weave environmental justice into every course in our curriculum. And we have an optional study abroad, which is also really nice, plus where you can study abroad and apply what you're learning in your courses. So I just wanted to again mention, if you're interested in learning more, this is not the place for that, but on March 15th at 6 p.m. And you can always email me. So let me turn that off and I'll put my email in the chat if anyone ever wants to reach out about Goucher Environmental Dialogues or the program or anything. You can always send me an email and ask about anything, and I'll happily respond. But we look forward to having you hopefully join us for future speaker series. And again, I want to thank Dr. White. And if you guys are able to, please give our speaker a round of virtual applause in the chat. Thank you, Tashari, for sharing your email as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. All right.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
everyone.
everyone.